How Vikings survived months at sea without going insane. The year is 793. Picture yourself standing on a windswept beach in Northumbria, England, watching the horizon where gray sky meets grayer sea. You're a monk at Lindisfarne Monastery, living a life of prayer and quiet devotion. Then you see them. Dark shapes emerging from the morning mist like phantoms materializing from nightmares. Long, serpentine vessels cutting through waves with unnatural speed, their dragon-headed prows rising and falling with predatory rhythm. Within hours, your world will be shattered by men who have spent weeks crossing an ocean that would break most human minds, yet they arrive not mad with isolation or broken by despair, but sharp, coordinated, and devastatingly effective. How is this possible? How did these seafarers endure weeks or even months confined to wooden vessels, no larger than a school bus, surrounded by nothing but endless water, constant danger, and the crushing weight of isolation, without losing their sanity? This question has haunted historians, psychologists, and adventurers for centuries. Modern sailors, with all the benefits of GPS, weather forecasting, comfortable cabins, and psychological support, still struggle with the mental toll of extended ocean voyages. Experienced mariners today report depression, anxiety, hallucinations, and personality changes after just weeks at sea in far more comfortable conditions than the Vikings ever knew. Yet these Norse warriors and explorers routinely undertook journeys that would last months, crossing the North Atlantic to Iceland, Greenland, and eventually North America, navigating by stars and intuition, sleeping on open decks in freezing temperatures, eating dried fish and stale water, constantly bailing seawater from their boats, and somehow maintaining the mental clarity to explore, trade, raid, and establish settlements on the other side of an ocean that terrified the rest of medieval Europe. Think about your own life for a moment. How long can you go without proper sleep before your thoughts start fragmenting? How many days of the same monotonous routine before crushing boredom sets in? How would you handle being trapped with the same 30 people for months with no escape, no privacy, no ability to walk away from conflict or tension? Now add to that equation the very real possibility of drowning at any moment, storms that could appear without warning and swallow your vessel whole, waves tall as buildings crashing over you day and night, salt spray blinding you, skin cracking from constant exposure to wind, and water hands bleeding from rope burns, the relentless cold that seeps into your bones and never leaves, the uncertainty of whether you'll ever see land again, and the knowledge that if you make one navigational error, you and everyone you care about will simply vanish into the void with no trace, no rescue, no hope. This was the reality of Viking seafaring. The wooden vessels they sailed, called longships or nares depending on their purpose, were marvels of engineering, but offered almost no protection from the elements. A typical Viking longship was approximately 70 to 80 feet long and 15 to 18 feet wide at its broadest point. Imagine living on a vessel smaller than two parking spaces placed end to end, sharing the confined space with 30 to 60 other people, all your supplies, weapons, trade goods, and livestock if you were attempting colonization. There were no cabins, no below-deck compartments for shelter, no galley for cooking, no toilets. Just an open hull with a single mast and sail in the middle, rowing benches along the sides, and whatever space remained for cargo and sleeping. The ship sat low in the water, meaning waves constantly washed over the deck. Every person aboard would be perpetually wet, perpetually cold, perpetually exposed. The Vikings called the ocean the Whale Road and the Gannet's Bath, poetic names that barely hint at the terror it inspired. Medieval European Christians feared the ocean so profoundly that most refused to venture beyond sight of land. The sea represented chaos, the unknown, the dwelling place of monsters and demons. Ancient maps marked unexplored waters with the warning, "Here be dragons." Yet the Norse not only conquered this fear, but built an entire culture around maritime mastery. They didn't just survive the psychological horror of deep ocean voyaging. They thrived in it, using it as a weapon, an advantage, a source of wealth and expansion that transformed medieval Europe. The psychological resilience this required seems almost superhuman. Were the Vikings simply built differently? Did they possess some genetic or cultural adaptation that made them immune to the isolation, monotony, and terror that breaks modern sailors? Or did they employ specific techniques, rituals, and social structures that allowed them to maintain their sanity against odds that seem impossible? Recent archaeological discoveries, experimental voyages using reconstructed Viking ships, psychological studies of isolation and confinement, and careful analysis of Norse sagas and historical accounts have begun to reveal the answer. What emerges is a picture far more complex and fascinating than simple hardiness or fearlessness. The Vikings survived months at sea through a sophisticated combination of cultural conditioning, social structure, practical routines, spiritual beliefs, storytelling traditions, and mental techniques that together formed a complete psychological survival system. They didn't simply endure the ocean. They transformed it from a source of terror into a familiar, navigable, almost intimate space through methods that modern psychology is only now beginning to understand and appreciate. But before we can understand how they maintained their sanity, we need to comprehend just how insane the conditions they faced truly were. We need to stand on those wave-soaked decks ourselves, feel the spray in our faces, and understand the precise nature of the psychological gauntlet that every Viking voyage represented. Only then can we appreciate the genius of their survival strategies. Let's begin with the physical reality of a Viking ocean crossing. The journey from Norway to Iceland, one of the more common routes, covered approximately 800 to 1,000 miles of open ocean. With favorable winds, this voyage could take as little as 7 days. But favorable winds were rare. More commonly, the journey took 2 to 3 weeks. In adverse conditions, it could stretch to a month or longer. The voyage from Iceland to Greenland added another 600 miles. From Greenland to Vinland, their name for part of North America, another 1,000 miles. These weren't leisurely cruises. These were desperate races against time, weather, and the limits of human endurance. A reconstructed Viking ship sailed from Norway to North America in 1991 to 1992 as part of the Saga Sigler expedition. The crew, composed of experienced modern sailors equipped with all the safety equipment and support systems contemporary maritime law requires, kept detailed journals of their experience, even with life jackets, radio communication, weather forecasting, backup vessels, and the knowledge that rescue was possible if conditions became truly desperate. The psychological toll was severe. Crew members reported vivid hallucinations after just 10 days. At sea, one sailor described seeing cities rising from the waves. Another reported conversations with people who weren't there. Several experienced profound depression and anxiety. Interpersonal conflicts erupted over trivial matters, nearly leading to violence on multiple occasions. The expedition leader noted that maintaining crew cohesion became harder than navigation itself. And this was with a crew who had volunteered knowing exactly what to expect, who could quit at any port, who faced nothing like the genuine mortal danger that attended every Viking voyage. Now imagine experiencing all of this without any of those safety nets. Imagine knowing that if a storm drives you off course, there's no radio to call for help, no GPS to tell you where you are, no weather forecast to warn you what's coming. Imagine that if you fall overboard, there's no life jacket, and the frigid North Atlantic water will kill you from hypothermia within minutes even if you can swim. Imagine that any serious injury or illness is a death sentence because there are no antibiotics, no surgical tools, no trained medical personnel beyond basic folk remedies. Imagine that you are not a volunteer on an adventure but a person whose survival and your family as survival depends on the success of this voyage. Whether you're raiding for wealth trading, for supplies, or fleeing to establish a new settlement because your home has become uninhabitable, the cold alone would be enough to break most people. The North Atlantic, even in summer, maintains surface temperatures between 40 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Constant exposure to wind, spray, and occasional waves washing over the deck meant every person aboard was perpetually wet. The Vikings had wool clothing, which retained some insulating properties even when soaked, and they knew to layer it. But wool doesn't dry in ocean conditions. It just stays damp and heavy. The combination of wet wool and wind creates a wine chill effect that draws heat from your body relentlessly. Your core temperature begins to drop. Your extremities go numb. Your thinking becomes sluggish. Hypothermia doesn't just threaten your life. It degrades your mental function first, making decision-making difficult, memory unreliable, and emotional regulation nearly impossible. Sleep was a cruel joke. There were no cabins, no hammocks, no bunks. You slept on the open deck or in the bilge, the bottom of the boat where water that leaked through the planking collected. Some crews brought leather sleeping bags sealed with grease for minimal water resistance, but even these offered only marginal protection. You slept in shifts because the ship needed constant manning. Someone had to steer. Someone had to watch for approaching storms or land or hazards. Someone had to bail water that perpetually leaked into the hull. The noise was constant. Waves crashing, wind howling through the rigging. The creak and groan of wood flexing under stress, men shouting to be heard over the chaos. The motion was relentless. The ship never stopped moving, never stayed still, rolling and pitching and yawing in three dimensions simultaneously. Many people became seasick and stayed seasick for days or weeks. Imagine vomiting from constant nausea while also trying to row, bail water, adjust rigging, and maintain your watch shift, all while soaked, freezing, exhausted, and terrified. Food and water presented their own psychological challenges. Fresh food was impossible. There was no refrigeration, no way to preserve meat or vegetables. The Vikings brought dried fish, dried meat, hard bread, butter preserved in barrels of brine, and small amounts of cheese. Drinking water was carried in wooden barrels and quickly became stale, developing a disgusting taste and smell. After a week or two at sea, the water would begin to spoil, becoming cloudy and foul, but still the only drinking option available. Archaeological evidence suggests they sometimes brought small amounts of mead or ale, which kept better than water, but never enough for the entire voyage. Imagine drinking rancid water because the alternative is death from dehydration. Imagine eating nothing but dried fish and moldy bread for weeks on end. The monotony of the diet alone would be psychologically crushing. Food is one of the few pleasures available in such extreme conditions, and even that becomes a source of misery rather than comfort. Privacy was non-existent. Every moment of every day, you were surrounded by other people in a space so confined that you could probably touch both sides of the ship simultaneously. There was nowhere to go to be alone with your thoughts, to process emotions, to escape conflict or tension. If you had an argument with someone, you couldn't walk away. You would see the person constantly, work alongside them, depend on them for survival, and they would depend on you. Interpersonal tension in such an environment doesn't just create discomfort. It becomes a survival threat. A crew that stops working together effectively is a crew that drowns. The psychological term for this kind of confinement stress is called expedition behavior syndrome in modern research. Studies of Antarctic research stations, submarines, spacecraft, and other isolated confined environments reveal a consistent pattern of psychological deterioration after an initial period of excitement and bonding. Usually lasting a few days to a week, crew cohesion begins to break down. People become irritable, withdrawn, or aggressive. Cliques form. Scapegoating occurs. Sleep disturbances multiply. Depression and anxiety increase. Cognitive function declines. In extreme cases, people experience psychotic breaks, severe dissociation, or suicidal ideation. And this happens even in environments far more comfortable than Viking ships, with trained personnel, psychological screening and support, regular resupply, and the certain knowledge that the isolation is temporary and rescue is possible. The Vikings faced all of this with none of the mitigating factors. So how did they maintain not just their sanity, but their effectiveness? How did they arrive at their destinations ready to fight, negotiate, explore, and build? The answer lies in a sophisticated web of cultural practices, social structures, and psychological techniques that deserve our closest attention. First, we must understand that the Vikings weren't just randomly tough people who happened to handle the ocean well. They were the product of a culture that had spent centuries developing specific adaptations for maritime survival. Norse society was organized around seafaring from childhood. Boys began training for ocean voyages from age 5 or 6, starting with short coastal trips in calm weather, gradually building to longer journeys in rougher conditions. By the time a young man took his first major ocean crossing, he might have spent years accumulating smaller experiences that normalized what would otherwise be terrifying novelty. This gradual exposure is a form of stress inoculation that psychologists now recognize as crucial for building resilience. The Vikings didn't face the ocean as strangers. They faced it as something familiar, something they had been preparing for their entire lives. This cultural familiarity extended to every aspect of seafaring. Viking children grew up hearing stories of ocean voyages. Their mythology was saturated with sea imagery. Their gods traveled by ship. Their concepts of death and the afterlife involved sea journeys. The very shape of their funeral practices included ship burials, placing the dead in vessels for their final voyage to the other world. The ocean wasn't an alien environment to be feared. It was woven into the fabric of their existence, as natural and inevitable as land itself. This cultural normalization dramatically reduced the psychological shock of ocean voyaging, where a medieval Christian sailor might face the sea with existential dread, viewing it as a realm of chaos and monsters. A Viking faced it with the confidence of someone entering a difficult but understood environment. But cultural familiarity alone doesn't explain their resilience. The Vikings also employed specific social structures that modern psychology recognizes as critical for maintaining mental health in isolated, confined conditions. The most important of these was the rigid hierarchy and role system aboard ship. Every person had a clearly defined position and responsibilities. There was a captain, usually the ship's owner, who made final decisions. There was a helmsman responsible for steering. There were designated navigators, though often the captain filled this role. There were specific crew members assigned to managing the sail, to bailing water, to keeping watch. Everyone knew exactly what was expected of them and when. This might sound oppressive or limiting, but in extreme conditions, clarity of role and purpose is psychologically stabilizing. Modern studies of confined environments consistently show that ambiguity and role confusion are major sources of stress and conflict. When everyone knows their job, when there's a clear chain of command, when expectations are explicit and shared, the cognitive load of navigating social dynamics decreases dramatically. You don't waste mental energy wondering what you should be doing or arguing about who is in charge. You focus on executing your role, and that focus itself becomes a psychological anchor. The Vikings reinforced the structure with a principle of shared hardship. The captain and elite warriors didn't enjoy privileged conditions. Everyone slept on the same wet deck, ate the same food, endured the same cold. The saga of Eric the Red describes how even the expedition leader took his turn at the oars and ate the same dried fish as the newest crew member. This equality in suffering is crucial for maintaining group cohesion. Modern military psychologists have found that soldiers endure extreme hardship far better when their leaders share that hardship visibly. It prevents resentment, builds solidarity, and creates a sense that the suffering has meaning and isn't being exploited. Beyond structure and shared hardship, the Vikings employed constant activity as a psychological defense mechanism. Idleness is the enemy of mental health in confined conditions. With nothing to do, the mind turns inward, dwelling on discomfort, fear, and negative thoughts in a destructive spiral. The Vikings combated this by ensuring there was always work to be done. Sailing a Viking ship required active participation from the entire crew almost constantly. In calm conditions with good wind, the sail could be set and the ship could travel with minimal intervention. But these conditions were rare. More commonly, the wind was unfavorable or inconsistent. requiring constant adjustment of the sail and frequent rowing. The ships leaked by design, their planks intentionally left loose enough to flex with the waves, which meant someone was always bailing water. Ropes had to be checked and adjusted. The mast had to be raised and lowered depending on conditions. Equipment had to be maintained and repaired. Food had to be distributed. Water had to be rationed. This constant activity served multiple psychological functions. It provided distraction from fear and discomfort. It created a sense of agency and control, however minimal, in a situation where most factors were beyond anyone's control. It produced physical exhaustion, which, while unpleasant, at least made sleep easier despite the terrible conditions. And it reinforced the sense of purpose and shared mission that gave the voyage meaning. You weren't just passively suffering. You were actively contributing to survival and success. But activity alone can become monotonous and soul-crushing if it's purely mechanical. This is where another crucial element of Viking psychological survival emerges: storytelling. The Norse had a rich oral tradition of sagas, poems, riddles, and histories that they brought to sea with them. Evening storytelling sessions, when conditions allowed, became crucial social and psychological events. Experienced sailors would recount previous voyages, battles, explorations. They would recite poems about gods and heroes. They would pose riddles and wordplay challenges. They would sing songs, some solemn and some bawdy, that everyone could join. The psychological value of this practice cannot be overstated. Stories transport the mind away from present suffering into imagined landscapes. They create emotional engagement beyond immediate circumstances. They reinforce cultural values and shared identity. They turn the crew from a collection of isolated individuals into a community with shared narratives and mutual understanding. The sagas themselves often contain stories of difficult voyages overcome, creating a narrative framework that helps sailors interpret their own suffering as meaningful and temporary rather than random and eternal. You weren't just a person being tortured by the ocean. You were continuing a tradition of heroes who had endured the same trials and emerged victorious. Your suffering had precedent and meaning within a larger story. Modern psychology has extensively studied the role of narrative and resilience and trauma processing. People who can construct coherent narratives about their suffering, who can place it within a larger framework of meaning, endure hardship far better than those who experience it as random chaos. The Viking storytelling tradition provided exactly this framework. Every difficult voyage could become a story worth telling, which meant the suffering itself was transformed from mere pain into experience with narrative value. This subtle psychological shift makes an enormous difference in how people endure extreme conditions. The Vikings also employed another psychological technique that modern research is only beginning to appreciate: ritual and rhythm. Life aboard a Viking ship followed predictable patterns. There were set times for changing watch shifts, for distributing food and water, for checking the rigging and bailing the bilge. In good weather, there were times for storytelling, for maintaining equipment, for practicing weapon skills. These rhythms created a sense of temporal structure in an environment where days could otherwise blur into an undifferentiated nightmare. Knowing what comes next, having a predictable schedule, provides cognitive anchoring that helps maintain sanity. Beyond secular rhythms, the Vikings brought religious ritual to sea. They made offerings to the gods before voyages and at crucial moments during the journey. They invoked Thor for protection against storms, Jor for safe passage, Odin for wisdom and navigation. Whether these gods actually existed or provided any real protection is beside the point psychologically. The act of ritual creates a sense of agency and connection to forces beyond the immediate situation. It provides a framework for interpreting random events as meaningful. When a storm passes without sinking the ship, you can attribute it to successful propitiation of the gods rather than mere luck. This attribution makes the world feel less random and more navigable, which reduces existential anxiety. Archaeological evidence reveals the extent of Viking ship ritual. Excavations of Viking-era harbors have found evidence of sacrificial offerings made before major voyages. Small figures of gods were often carried aboard ships. Some sagas describe elaborate pre-voyage ceremonies involving feasting, sacrifice, and prophetic consultations. These weren't just superstitions. They were psychological technologies for managing fear and uncertainty. But perhaps the most crucial factor in Vikings' psychological resilience at sea was something more fundamental than any specific technique or practice. It was the simple fact that they believed they could survive. This might sound circular or tautological, but it points to a profound truth about human psychology. Belief in the possibility of success dramatically affects actual success rates in extreme conditions. Studies of survival in disasters, shipwrecks, wilderness ordeals, and prisoner-of-war camps consistently show that people who maintain belief in their eventual survival have dramatically higher actual survival rates than those who succumb to despair even when their objective circumstances are identical. The Vikings had centuries of accumulated evidence that ocean crossings were survivable. They had stories of successful voyages vastly outnumbering stories of disasters. They had miners who had survived multiple crossings and could demonstrate that it was possible. They had a cultural identity built around being seafarers who conquered the whale road. This collective evidence created a psychological foundation of confidence that insulated them against despair even in terrible conditions. They weren't pioneers facing unknown odds. They were inheritors of a proven tradition. This confidence was reinforced by their navigational skill, which was far more sophisticated than later European accounts often acknowledged. The Vikings couldn't rely on compasses, which weren't widely available in Europe until the 13th century, well after the Viking Age. They couldn't use precise charts or instruments for measuring latitude and longitude, yet they navigated across open ocean with remarkable accuracy, which meant they had genuine reason to trust their ability to find their way. How did they navigate without instruments? This question has fascinated researchers for generations. The sagas mention mysterious sunstones that could locate the sun even through heavy clouds. For many years, historians dismissed this as pure myth. Then in 1967, a Danish archaeologist discovered that certain crystals, particularly Iceland spar, a form of calcite common in volcanic regions like Iceland and Norway, have optical properties that allow them to detect polarized light, even when the sun is hidden behind clouds or just below the horizon. These crystals can reveal the sun's position by showing distinct patterns when rotated and held up to the sky. Experimental tests have confirmed that navigators using these crystals could maintain accurate headings even in overcast conditions that would leave modern sailors without electronic navigation completely lost. The Vikings also used sophisticated observational techniques for navigation. They tracked the flight patterns of seabirds, knowing that certain species never traveled more than a specific distance from land. They observed ocean swells and currents, learning to distinguish subtle patterns that indicated proximity to land or the direction of distant shores. They noted watercolor changes that suggested shallow areas or underwater geographic features. They watched for clouds that formed predictably over land masses, even when the land itself was beyond the horizon. They memorized the positions of stars and the sun's path at different latitudes, creating mental maps that allowed them to maintain course across thousands of miles, perhaps most. Remarkably, they understood latitude sailing long before it became standard in European navigation, by sailing north or south until they reached the latitude of their destination, then sailing east or west at that latitude until they reached land. They could navigate the specific locations across vast distances. They knew, for instance, that if you sailed west from Bergen, Norway, maintaining the same latitude, you would eventually strike the southern coast of Iceland. From southern Iceland, sail west at the same latitude and you'd reach southern Greenland. This technique required careful observation of celestial positions to maintain latitude, and extraordinary patience to trust the process over hundreds of miles of open ocean. But it worked with impressive reliability. This navigational competence wasn't just practically important, it was psychologically crucial. knowing that your helmsman could find the way, that the voyage wasn't just aimless wandering but directed travel along understood routes, provided enormous psychological comfort. You weren't lost at the mercy of chaos. You were on a path, following technique that had worked for generations. This sense of directed movement toward a known destination, even when the destination was weeks away and invisible beyond the horizon, helped maintain hope and sanity. But let's not romanticize the Viking experience. The psychological toll was real, severe, and sometimes devastating. The sagas, which tend to celebrate heroism and minimize weakness, still contain revealing glimpses of the mental cost. In the Greenlander's saga, one account describes a crew member who became convinced that the ship was cursed and tried to sabotage it to force a return to port. In the saga of Eric the Red, there are references to crew members who became seasick in their minds, a phrase that suggests psychological breakdown distinct from mere physical illness. Several sagas mention crew members who refused to undertake another voyage after particularly difficult experiences, suggesting post-traumatic effects that ended their seafaring careers. Archaeological evidence also hints at the psychological cost. Skeletal remains of known seafarers show stress markers in their bones, evidence of severe and repeated physical hardship. Some show signs of malnutrition despite being from relatively high-status individuals who should have had good access to food, suggesting the deprivation of long voyages couldn't be fully compensated even when they returned to land. We can reasonably infer that physical stress of this magnitude would be accompanied by psychological stress. Modern experimental voyages provide additional insight. In 2016, a team of historians and sailors attempted to recreate Viking ocean crossing conditions as authentic as possible, using a reconstructed longship and avoiding all modern conveniences beyond essential safety equipment required by law. They documented severe psychological effects within the first week. Hallucinations were common. Several crew members reported dissociative episodes where they felt detached from their bodies, or uncertain whether they were awake or dreaming. Paranoid thoughts emerged, with crew members becoming suspicious of each other's motives or competence without rational basis. Emotional regulation deteriorated, with people crying unexpectedly or flying into disproportionate rage over minor provocations. What is particularly revealing is that these effects occurred despite the crew knowing, intellectually, that the voyage was temporary, that rescue was possible, that modern medicine was available if needed. The psychological impact of the conditions themselves was powerful enough to override cognitive awareness of safety. This suggests that Vikings facing the same conditions without any of those safety nets must have experienced even more severe psychological effects. So if the psychological toll was this severe, how did the Vikings not just survive, but function effectively enough to explore, trade, raid, and settle across vast distances? The answer seems to be that they didn't avoid psychological damage. They experienced it, but had cultural frameworks that allowed them to integrate and normalize it, rather than being destroyed by it. This is a crucial distinction. Modern Western psychology often assumes that mental health means the absence of distress or trauma symptoms. But psychological resilience research increasingly suggests that true resilience isn't about avoiding damage. It's about maintaining function despite damage and recovering after exposure to extreme stress. The Vikings lived in a culture that normalized hardship and suffering as inevitable parts of existence. Their mythology celebrated gods who endured terrible ordeals. Odin hung himself from the world tree for 9 days to gain wisdom. Thor regularly faced seemingly impossible challenges. The entire cosmology was built around an understanding that existence involved struggle and suffering, culminating in Ragnarok, the end of the world, and apocalyptic battle. This wasn't a grim or nihilistic worldview. It was realistic about the presence of suffering while simultaneously affirming that life was worth living and fighting for despite that suffering. This cultural framework allowed Vikings to experience severe psychological distress during voyages without interpreting it as abnormal or shameful. Feeling terrified during a storm wasn't weakness. It was rational acknowledgement of danger. Experiencing hallucinations after weeks of sleep deprivation and sensory monotony wasn't madness. It was an expected consequence of extreme conditions. Crying from exhaustion and misery wasn't failure. It was human response to inhuman circumstances. By normalizing these responses, Viking culture prevented the secondary trauma that often compounds primary trauma. You weren't crazy for struggling. You were normal. This cultural normalization was reinforced by the community experience of shared suffering. Everyone on the ship was experiencing the same hardships. When you looked around and saw others also struggling, also terrified, also exhausted, it confirmed that your responses were appropriate rather than aberrant. Modern psychology recognizes this as crucial for trauma processing. Isolation magnifies trauma. Community diffuses it. The confined space of a Viking ship, despite all its physical disadvantages, created intense social bonds that helped insulate individuals from psychological breakdown. The intensity of these bonds shouldn't be underestimated. A Viking crew undertaking a major voyage would live in closer proximity and more complete interdependence than most modern people ever experience. You would know the smell, the sound, the rhythm of every person aboard. You would know their strengths and weaknesses, their fears and hopes, their stories and songs. They would know yours. This forced intimacy could certainly create friction and conflict, but it also created genuine community. You weren't isolated individuals who happened to be in the same terrible situation. You were a collective unit whose survival depended on mutual support and coordination. This community extended beyond the immediate voyage. Viking society was organized around kinship networks and oaths of loyalty that created long-term bonds. The people you sailed with weren't strangers or casual acquaintances. They were often kinsmen, oath brothers, members of your household or community. You had relationships with them that preceded the voyage and would continue after it. This meant the behavior during the voyage had reputational consequences that mattered deeply. If you broke down, if you failed in your duties, if you created unnecessary conflict, it would affect your standing in the community long term. Conversely, demonstrating courage, reliability, and skill during difficult conditions earned reputation and status that had real social value. This reputation economy created powerful incentives for maintaining psychological function, even under extreme duress. You had reason to control your fear, manage your despair, fulfill your responsibilities, and support your crewmates even when everything in you wanted to collapse. This might sound like mere social pressure to conform, but research on resilience suggests that external motivation and accountability can be powerful supports for mental health in extreme conditions. Having a reason to persevere beyond your own survival, having responsibilities to others that you take seriously, having awareness that your behavior is observed and will be judged. These factors help people maintain discipline and function when purely internal. Motivation might fail. The Vikings also benefited from a particular conception of fate and agency that helped them navigate the psychological tension between control and helplessness that ocean voyaging entails. They believe in a concept called word, a complex idea about fate and destiny that modern translations often oversimplify. Word wasn't simple predestination. It was more like an understanding that certain outcomes were probable or inevitable based on accumulated past actions, character, and circumstances, but that within those constraints, individual choices and courage still mattered. This belief allowed Vikings to simultaneously accept that they might die on any voyage, that the ocean was dangerous and ultimately beyond complete control, while still believing that their skill, effort, and courage made a genuine difference to outcomes. You couldn't control whether a storm arose, but you could control how you responded to it. You couldn't guarantee survival, but you could maximize the probability of survival through preparation, skill, and determination. Your fate was ultimately in the hands of the gods and word, but you still had responsibility to do everything in your power to achieve success. This is psychologically sophisticated. Modern psychology recognizes that effective coping with uncontrollable situations requires exactly this balance between acceptance of what you can't control and active engagement with what you can. People who try to control everything experience anxiety and failure. When inevitable, uncontrollable events occur, people who accept everything passively become helpless and depressed. The Vikings' conception of war provided a cultural framework that encouraged the optimal balance. We see this balance reflected in their practical preparations. Viking ships carried offerings to make to the gods, but also spare sails, extra rope, backup oars, repair materials, navigation tools. They prayed for good weather, but also studied weather patterns and seasonal timing to choose the best periods for voyaging. They accepted that death was possible, but also trained rigorously in swimming, seamanship, and survival skills to maximize their chances. They faced the ocean with both humility and confidence, a paradoxical combination that seems to have been psychologically optimal. Another crucial factor in Viking psychological resilience was their relationship with identity and masculinity. Norse culture placed enormous value on courage, particularly the ability to face death without fear or complaint. The ideal warrior was someone who could stare into the face of certain death and respond with defiant humor rather than despair. The sagas are full of examples of this ideal. Warriors who, when mortally wounded, make jokes about their injuries. Heroes who, when facing overwhelming odds, respond with witty boasts rather than panic. This cultural ideal wasn't just posturing. It was a psychological technique for managing fear. By making courage and humor in the face of death a core component of admirable masculine identity, Viking culture gave men a role to perform that helped them override natural fear responses. You weren't just trying to survive. You were trying to embody an ideal, to live up to a cultural standard that you and everyone around you had been trained to value from childhood. This provided structure and purpose to fear management. Instead of just trying to suppress or ignore terror, which rarely works, you had a positive script to follow. Face the danger, acknowledge it, respond to it with courage and, if possible, with humor. Fulfill your responsibilities regardless of outcome, and thereby demonstrate your worth as a person. Modern military psychology uses similar techniques. Soldiers are trained to channel fear into action, to rely on drill procedures and unique cohesion, to identify with a warrior ethos that helps them function under fire despite natural terror responses. The Vikings developed a cultural version of this military psychology that they applied to ocean voyaging. The ocean was their battlefield, and they faced it with the same ethos they brought to armed combat. This masculine ideal had a dark side, of course. It likely prevented some Vikings from acknowledging psychological distress or seeking support when they needed it. The sagas occasionally hint at this, mentioning men who were respected as great warriors but who became strange or withdrawn after particular traumatic experiences, suggesting untreated psychological wounds. The cultural emphasis on stoicism and courage may have helped people function during crises but hindered recovery afterward. This is a pattern we see in many warrior cultures, ancient and modern. The same cultural tools that help people endure extreme stress can become barriers to healing from that stress later. But in the specific context of surviving extended ocean voyages, the emphasis on courage and duty seems to have been functionally adaptive. During the voyage itself, when there was no opportunity for recovery or treatment anyway, when survival depended on continued function despite psychological distress, having a cultural framework that supported suppression of fear and maintenance of duty was probably optimal, even if it created problems later. The Vikings also employed a technique that modern psychology would recognize as cognitive reappraisal. They deliberately reframed the hardships of seafaring as opportunities, rather than just suffering to be endured. A difficult voyage was a chance to prove yourself, to earn reputation, to demonstrate courage, to create stories worth telling. The worse the conditions, the greater the glory in surviving them. The sagas celebrate not the easy voyages but the difficult ones, not the comfortable passages but the desperate struggles against overwhelming odds. This cultural reframing transformed suffering from meaningless pain into meaningful challenge. You weren't being tortured by random cruelty of nature. You were being tested, and passing the test had value. Modern psychological research on post-traumatic growth consistently finds that people who can find meaning in suffering, who can reframe trauma as a source of growth or strength, or wisdom rather than pure damage, recover better, and sometimes even report positive long-term changes from terrible experiences. The Viking cultural framework encouraged exactly this kind of meaning-making. Every hardship at sea could become part of your personal saga, part of the narrative of who you were and what you had accomplished. This didn't make the suffering less real or less terrible in the moment, but it placed it within a framework that gave it purpose and transformed it from pure loss into complex experience with both costs and benefits. Let us also consider the role of hope and tangible goals in maintaining Viking psychological resilience during long voyages. Modern studies of extreme confinement consistently show that having concrete, achievable goals dramatically improve psychological outcomes. Antarctic researchers who focus on specific scientific objectives, submariners who are working toward completion of defined missions, prisoners of war who set small achievable goals like maintaining their health or communicating with fellow prisoners all fare better psychologically than those who simply try to wait out their confinement passively. Vikings on ocean voyages had clear, tangible goals. They were traveling to specific destinations for specific purposes. Raiders were seeking wealth and glory. Traders were seeking profit from exchanges of goods. Settlers were seeking land and new opportunities. Explorers were seeking knowledge of new territories. These goals provided psychological anchors, reasons to endure present suffering. Every day at sea was a day closer to achieving the objective. Every mile covered was progress, not just time passing. This sense of movement toward a meaningful goal is psychologically powerful. The goals were also realistic based on experience. Vikings weren't pursuing impossible fantasies. They were undertaking difficult but demonstrably achievable objectives. Iceland had been successfully settled. Greenland had been reached. Trade routes to the east had been established. New crews undertaking these voyages were following paths that others had successfully traveled. This meant their hope was grounded in evidence rather than just wishful thinking, which made it more psychologically sustainable. The physical act of approaching land after a long voyage must have provided extraordinary psychological relief and validation. Imagine spending weeks or months surrounded by nothing but ocean, watching the same empty horizon day after day, beginning to question whether land even exists anymore, whether the world is anything but water, whether you'll spend the rest of your life trapped in this wet wooden prison. Then one day, a sailor on watch calls out. In the distance, a dark line that's not a cloud. Mountains, Iceland's volcanic peaks rising from the sea, Greenland's glaciers catching the sun, the forested coast of Vinland. The sight of land after extended ocean travel creates emotional responses that people who haven't experienced it struggle to understand. It's not just relief, it's validation of everything you've endured, proof that the goal was real, confirmation that navigation worked, evidence that the voyage has meaning and has reached its culmination. Several sagas describe elaborate rituals and celebrations when land was sighted after long voyages. Offerings to the gods, communal feasting, songs, and stories. These weren't just religious observance, they were psychological release. Communal acknowledgement of shared ordeal survived. Collective transition from the liminal space of ocean, travel back to the structured world of land. The psychological import of these moments can't be overstated. They provided closure to the traumatic experience of the voyage and helped crews process and integrate what they had endured. But we should also acknowledge that not all Viking voyages ended successfully. Ships were lost. Crews vanished without trace. The sagas mention these losses, usually briefly, but archaeological evidence and climate data suggest they were probably more common than successful voyages were eager to emphasize. The Greenland settlement ultimately failed, likely due to deteriorating climate conditions that made regular contact with Iceland and Europe increasingly difficult and eventually impossible. How many ships were lost in those failures? How many crews endured weeks at sea only to be swamped by storms or driven off course into the empty Atlantic to die slowly of thirst and starvation? We have to assume that for every successful voyage we know about, there were unsuccessful ones we don't, where psychological resilience ultimately didn't matter because the physical circumstances were simply insurmountable. The Vikings survived months at sea when conditions allowed survival. When conditions didn't allow it, all their courage and skill and cultural techniques couldn't save them. This is important to remember. Vikings' psychological resilience was remarkable, but it wasn't superhuman. They were people, subject to the same limitations all people face. They died when they were unlucky or when they made mistakes or when the ocean simply overwhelmed them. The psychological cost of knowing this reality must have been significant. Every Viking undertaking an ocean voyage knew that people regularly vanished at sea. They would have known specific individuals who never returned from voyages. They would have heard stories of disasters, yet they went anyway, which suggests either remarkable courage or remarkable ability to compartmentalize risk. Probably both. Modern psychology recognizes that people are generally bad at assessing low-probability, high-consequence risks. We tend to either ignore them completely or become paralyzed by them. The Vikings seem to have achieved a functional middle ground where they acknowledged the risk, but didn't allow it to prevent action. This might have been facilitated by their belief in fate and the afterlife. If you believe your death day was already determined by word, then worrying about it was pointless. If you believe that dying bravely in pursuit of worthy goals would earn you a place in Valhalla or Falkvanger, the halls of the honored dead, then death lost some of its terror. These beliefs might seem irrational from a modern secular perspective, but from a psychological function perspective, they were highly adaptive. They allowed people to take necessary risks without being paralyzed by fear of death. Let's also consider the role of previous success in maintaining psychological resilience. During difficult moments, for Vikings who had survived previous voyages, every new voyage benefited from the psychological confidence built by past success. You had faced the ocean before and survived. You had endured terrible conditions before and emerged intact. This experiential knowledge provided a foundation of confidence that could sustain you through new difficulties. You weren't facing the unknown. You were facing the difficult but familiar. For first-time voyagers, this confidence was borrowed from elders and mentors. The presence of experienced sailors who had survived multiple crossings provided tangible evidence that survival was possible. When a young sailor felt overwhelmed by fear or despair, he could look at the grizzled veteran calmly managing the sail or steering the ship and think, "He's been through this before and survived. I can do the same." This is why the mixing of experienced and inexperienced crew members was psychologically important. The veterans anchored the psychological state of the entire crew. The sagas hint at this dynamic in descriptions of how crews were assembled. A wise captain would ensure a mixture of youth and experience, strength and wisdom, enthusiasm and steadiness. This wasn't just about practical skill distribution. It was about creating a crew with psychological balance. The young provided physical strength and energy. The experienced provided stability and confidence. Together they formed a unit more resilient than either group would be alone. We should also consider the psychological impact of natural phenomena the Vikings would have encountered at sea. The North Atlantic is home to bioluminescent organisms that create glowing wakes and light up disturbed water. On dark nights, every wave breaking around the ship would shimmer with ethereal blue-green light. The effect is magical and strange, beautiful and unsettling. The Vikings would have seen this regularly and incorporated it into their mythology and understanding of the ocean. Some scholars suggest that reports of sea serpents and other marine monsters might have been inspired partly by these bioluminescent displays creating patterns that look like massive creatures moving beneath the ship. The psychological impact of witnessing such phenomena repeatedly during long voyages would be significant. On one hand, the beauty might provide moments of wonder and awe that broke up the monotony and suffering. On the other hand, The strangeness might contribute to the sense of the ocean as a magical, uncanny space governed by different rules than the familiar world of land. The Vikings interpreted these experiences through their mythological framework. The ocean was the domain of particular gods and spirits. Strange sights weren't just natural phenomena, but manifestations of divine or supernatural presences. This interpretation might have made the experiences less psychologically destabilizing than if they had been completely inexplicable. The Vikings would also have witnessed other natural phenomena that modern science can explain, but that must have seemed magical or terrifying to them. The northern lights, aurora borealis, would have been visible during northern voyages, creating vast curtains and spirals of colored light dancing across the sky. Unusual cloud formations, optical effects from ice crystals in the atmosphere, rare celestial events. Each of these could be integrated into the mythological framework or could become a source of wonder and story. But some phenomena would have been purely terrifying. Massive storms that appeared with little warning, driven by atmospheric patterns the Vikings couldn't predict. Rogue waves, freak ocean swells that could rise to heights of 60 or 70 feet, tall enough to swamp a longship instantly. Ice in northern waters, bergs and flows that could crush a wooden hull. Waterspouts, marine tornadoes that could capsize vessels. The ocean offered no shortage of deadly surprises. Surviving encounters with these phenomena required not just skill, but extraordinary psychological control. Panic is deadly at sea. A crew that loses its collective nerve and stops working in coordinated fashion is a crew that drowns. The Vikings must have developed powerful techniques for managing panic collectively. Part of this was the rigid command structure. In a crisis, you followed orders without question or hesitation. You didn't stop to debate or analyze. You trusted that the captain knew what to do and you executed your assigned role immediately and completely. This kind of disciplined response to crisis requires extensive training and cultural conditioning, which the Vikings clearly had. But it also requires a particular psychological stance toward danger. Instead of freezing or fleeing when confronted with mortal threat, you had to be able to channel fear into focused action. This is the essence of courage as the Vikings understood it. Not the absence of fear, but the ability to function despite it. The cultural emphasis on this kind of courage meant that Vikings were trained from childhood to practice this psychological stance first in small ways during minor dangers, gradually building to the ability to maintain it even in the face of death. Let's consider a specific scenario to understand how all these factors work together. Imagine you're a 20-year-old Norwegian sailor in the year 930 on your second voyage across the North Atlantic to Iceland. Your first voyage the previous year was relatively uneventful, which gave you confidence but perhaps didn't fully prepare you for what the ocean can do. You've been at sea for 9 days. The first week went well, good winds, steady progress. But 3 days ago the wind shifted and strengthened. Now you're in the teeth of a serious storm. The ship is pitching so violently that staying on your feet is almost impossible. Waves are crashing over the bow every few seconds, sending torrents of freezing water sweeping across the deck. You're bailing water from the bilge in a rotation with 5 other men, working as fast as you can. But the water keeps coming. Your hands are bleeding from rope burns and your fingers are so numb you can barely grip the bucket. You haven't slept properly in 3 days. You're soaked through, shivering uncontrollably, exhausted beyond description. The sky is a uniform gray, making it impossible to determine position or direction. You have no idea if you're on course or hopelessly lost. Every wave feels like it might be the one that swamps the ship and sends everyone to the bottom. Terror is a physical sensation in your chest and stomach. Your mind keeps presenting images of drowning, of the ship breaking apart, of dying miles from land without anyone ever knowing what happened to you. Part of you wants to curl up and give in to despair, but you don't. Why not? First, you have a specific job to do. You're bailing water, and if you stop, the ship will sink faster. Your role is clear, and your action has visible impact. Every bucket of water you throw over the side is progress, however small. This gives you something to focus on besides fear. Second, you're not alone. All around you, other men are also bailing, also adjusting rigging, also struggling to keep the ship functional. Your uncle is at the helm, a man who survived a dozen ocean crossings. His presence is steady despite the chaos. If he can stay calm and focused, so can you. The collective effort creates a psychological container that holds your individual fear. Third, you have a cultural script to follow. This is a test of courage, an opportunity to prove yourself. The story of this storm will be told afterward, and how you behave matters. You want to be someone who met the challenge well, not someone who broke. This external motivation supports your internal struggle to maintain function. Fourth, you have interpretive frameworks for what's happening. This is the ocean's nature, the realm of Thor and Jord, powerful but not malicious. The storm is terrible but not unprecedented. Others have survived worse. This voyage will end. Either you'll reach Iceland or you'll die. But either way, the current state won't last forever. This temporal perspective helps you endure. You don't have to do this forever, just until the storm breaks or the outcome is decided. Fifth, you have skills you trust. The ship was built by craftsmen who knew their trade. The captain knows how to navigate. The crew knows how to handle the vessel. These skills aren't guarantees, but they're real. You have genuine reason to hope for survival beyond just wishful thinking. Sixth, you have philosophical acceptance. If this is your word, your fate, then fighting it is pointless. But if you're meant to survive, you have to do your part. Either way, the correct action is the same. Fulfill your duty as well as you can and let fate handle the outcome. All these factors together allow you to keep bailing water, to keep functioning, to ride out the storm without psychologically breaking even though the fear never goes away and the physical misery is overwhelming. This is how Vikings survived. Not by being immune to fear or suffering, but by having cultural and psychological tools that allowed them to function despite it. Now imagine that after 4 days, the storm begins to break. The wind eases, the waves diminish, the sky starts to clear. Exhaustion hits you like a physical blow as adrenaline fades. You collapse on the deck and sleep for 12 hours straight despite being soaked and cold. When you wake, the ship is moving steadily west under good wind. The sun is visible. The captain has taken sightings and believes you're still on course, only slightly pushed south by the storm. The mood aboard ship is transformed. Men are joking, telling stories about the worst moments of the storm, already beginning to turn the traumatic experience into narrative. You realize you survived something that could have killed you. The fear is being metabolized into pride, the suffering into accomplishment. You're part of a crew that faced a serious storm and came through. This is experience that has value, that makes you more capable, more confident, more respected. The trauma doesn't disappear, but it's being integrated into a larger story about who you are and what you can do. This is the psychological process the Vikings repeated across countless voyages. Each difficult experience survived became foundation for confidence during the next one. Each storm weathered became a story worth telling. Each voyage completed became evidence that the ocean, while dangerous, was navigable. But we should also consider what happened to Vikings after they reached their destinations. Did the psychological impact of long voyages simply evaporate once they set foot on land? Almost certainly not. Modern research on extreme environment psychology consistently shows that re-entry and readjustment can be as challenging as the initial adaptation to extreme conditions. Astronauts returning from space stations, researchers leaving Antarctica, submariners completing long deployments, all report difficulty readjusting to normal life. The Vikings probably experienced similar challenges. After weeks or months in a confined space with the same small group, interacting with the constant presence and dangers of the ocean, readjusting to the different rhythms and social contexts of life on land would have required psychological recalibration. Some Vikings might have found this difficult. The sagas occasionally mention men who became restless on land, who couldn't settle, who felt compelled to return to sea repeatedly. This might have been cultural expectation of the adventurous warrior. but it might also have reflected genuine psychological difficulty reintegrating into settled life. After intense maritime experiences, there's also the question of cumulative psychological toll. Did Vikings who survived many voyages experience long-term psychological effects? We know that repeated exposure to trauma can lead to chronic psychological changes even in resilient individuals. Combat veterans who function well through multiple deployments sometimes experience delayed psychological impacts. The Viking equivalent might have been the experienced sailor, who had survived dozens of voyages but who eventually became strange or withdrawn, who struggled with moods or behaviors that their community found difficult to understand. The sagas hint at this occasionally. There are references to great warriors who became hermits in their later years, to successful traders who suddenly abandoned their professions, to respected leaders who made inexplicable decisions or acted in ways that puzzled their contemporaries. Without modern psychological vocabulary, the sagas can identify these as potential cases of what we might now recognize as post-traumatic stress or other psychological consequences of repeated extreme stress. But the patterns are suggestive. This raises interesting questions about how Viking society handled psychological casualties of their maritime culture. In a society that valued courage and stoicism so highly, what happened to people who were psychologically broken by their experiences? Were they supported or marginalized? Did they receive care, or were they quietly excluded from positions of authority and responsibility? The evidence is too limited to answer definitively, but it's a dimension of Viking maritime psychology worth considering. Let's also examine how Viking psychological resilience at sea compares to other maritime cultures. The Vikings weren't the only pre-modern people to undertake long ocean voyages. Polynesian navigators crossed even larger stretches of ocean, settling islands scattered across the Pacific. Arab and Indian Ocean traders regularly sailed across the Indian Ocean. Chinese fleets conducted maritime expeditions. Each of these cultures developed their own techniques for maintaining psychological resilience. During extended voyages, comparing them reveals both universal patterns and cultural variations. The Polynesians, for instance, developed navigation techniques even more sophisticated than the Vikings in some ways, using star paths, ocean swells, bird migrations, and other indicators to find tiny islands across thousands of miles of open Pacific. They also developed social structures aboard their double-hulled voyaging canoes that distributed responsibilities and created community cohesion. Their mythology, like the Vikings, integrated ocean voyaging into cultural identity, making the sea a familiar rather than alien space. The specific techniques differed, but the underlying principles were similar. Gradual cultural conditioning from childhood, clear role structures, shared hardship, narrative frameworks for meaning-making, and spiritual practices that provided psychological comfort. This suggests that the challenges of maintaining sanity during long ocean voyages are universal human challenges, not specific to Vikings, and that different cultures have arrived at broadly similar solutions through independent development. This makes sense from an evolutionary psychology perspective. Humans evolved primarily as terrestrial creatures. We're not naturally adapted to prolonged ocean voyaging. Any culture that takes up maritime exploration has to develop cultural technologies to compensate for our biological limitations. The fact that different cultures arrived at similar solutions suggests these solutions represent genuine discoveries about human psychological needs in extreme environments, not just arbitrary cultural inventions. But the Vikings had some unique factors that distinguished their approach. Their particular cultural emphasis on courage in the face of death, inherited from their warrior traditions, gave them psychological tools that were especially well suited to the mortal dangers of ocean voyaging. Their social structure, with its emphasis on personal loyalty, oath bonds, and reputation, created powerful social incentives for maintaining function during crises. Their mythology, with its emphasis on fate and the celebration of heroic struggle, provided narrative frameworks that made suffering meaningful. These specifically Viking cultural features adapted well to maritime challenges. It's also worth considering how Vikings' psychological approaches to ocean voyaging influenced later European maritime culture. When European nations began undertaking ocean exploration in the 15th and 16th centuries, they had access to Viking precedents and possibly to remnants of Viking knowledge that had been preserved in Iceland and other Norse-influenced regions. Did Viking techniques influence the development of later maritime psychology? It's difficult to trace direct lineages, but there are suggestive parallels. The rigid hierarchical structure of later European navies, the emphasis on discipline and duty, the creation of maritime traditions and rituals, the use of shared hardship to build crew cohesion, all echo patterns that the Vikings had developed centuries earlier. The psychological challenge of long ocean voyages remained serious throughout the Age of Sail and into the modern era. Scurvy, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency, killed more sailors than warfare or shipwreck for centuries. The psychological impact of watching crewmates slowly waste away from this mysterious disease must have been devastating. Mutinies, though rarer than popular culture suggests, did occur when psychological breaking points were reached. The practice of flogging and harsh punishment in European navies suggests that maintaining discipline and function during long voyages was difficult enough, that authorities felt brutal enforcement was necessary. In this context, the Viking achievement seems even more remarkable. They maintained effective crew cohesion and function during months-long voyages. Without the formal military discipline that later navies would employ, they did so through cultural conditioning, social structures, and psychological techniques that were internalized rather than externally enforced. This suggests a level of individual psychological resilience and collective psychological sophistication that we should recognize as genuinely impressive. Let's return to the fundamental question: how did Vikings survive months at sea without going insane? By now, we've explored multiple dimensions of the answer. They survived through comprehensive cultural preparation from childhood that normalized ocean voyaging, through social structures that provided clear roles, shared hardship, and mutual accountability, through narrative traditions that gave meaning to suffering and transformed trauma into story, through spiritual beliefs that provided frameworks for interpreting random events and managing existential fear, through practical routines that maintained structure and purpose, through navigational skills that justified confidence and eventual success, through cultural values that made courage and duty central to identity, through communal bonds that distributed psychological load across the group, rather than leaving individuals isolated with their fear. They survived, in other words, not through any single technique, but through a complete cultural system that addressed every dimension of the psychological challenge. This system wasn't invented deliberately by any individual. It evolved over centuries as Norse culture adapted to maritime existence. The techniques that worked were preserved and transmitted. The approaches that failed were abandoned. What emerged was a sophisticated psychological survival system that allowed Vikings to routinely accomplish what seemed impossible to other medieval Europeans. But even with all these factors, they didn't always survive. The ocean is powerful and indifferent. Skill and courage and culture can maximize your chances but can't guarantee outcomes. Some Vikings went mad despite all their resilience. Some ships were lost despite all their skill. Some voyages ended in disaster despite all their preparation. The Vikings understood this. Their concept of word acknowledged that fate ultimately operated beyond complete human control. They went to sea anyway, accepting the risk as the price of the rewards that maritime mastery offered. What rewards justified such risks? For raiders, the answer was wealth and glory. A successful raid on a wealthy monastery or town could provide riches that would be impossible to accumulate through farming or local trade. The risk of death or madness at sea was balanced against the possibility of returning home wealthy and celebrated. For traders, the answer was profit from exchanges that were only possible across maritime distances. Goods that were common in one region could be exotic and valuable in another. For settlers, the answer was land and opportunity. Iceland and Greenland offered fertile ground for people who found Norway too crowded or politically constrained. For explorers, the answer was knowledge and the fame that came from discovering new territories. These motivations were powerful enough to drive people to undertake terrifying risks. This is a pattern we see throughout human history. People will endure extraordinary hardship and danger in pursuit of goals they find sufficiently valuable. The Vikings' goals were valuable enough, and their cultural tools for managing the psychological costs were effective enough, that maritime voyaging became not just survivable, but attractive to large numbers of people across several centuries. This raises a final interesting question. Could modern people, with all our psychological knowledge and technological advantages, match Vikings' psychological resilience in similar conditions? If we were placed on a reconstructed Viking ship without modern safety equipment or communication devices and sent across the North Atlantic using only Viking-era techniques, could we survive psychologically? The experimental voyages we discussed suggest the answer might be no. Modern sailors on reconstructed Viking ships, even with full knowledge of what to expect and choice to participate, have experienced severe psychological distress. Part of this is surely that we were not culturally conditioned from childhood to view such voyages as normal, but it might also reflect that modern culture, with its emphasis on comfort, safety, and individual autonomy, actually leaves us psychologically less prepared for extreme hardship than the Vikings were. The Vikings grew up in a culture that accepted suffering and danger as inevitable parts of existence. Modern Western culture, especially in wealthy nations, operates on the assumption that suffering should be minimized and danger should be eliminated. This makes our lives more comfortable and safer, which is clearly valuable, but it might also leave us less psychologically prepared to handle extreme conditions. When we encounter them, we're not practiced in enduring severe hardship. We're not culturally trained to maintain function despite overwhelming discomfort. We have less experience with the kind of communal interdependence that sustained Viking crews. This doesn't mean modern people are weaker or less capable. It means we've specialized in different psychological skills. We're better at innovation, at abstract thinking, at managing complexity, but we might be worse at simple endurance, at maintaining psychological equilibrium in extreme physical conditions. The Vikings were the product of their environment and culture, optimized for challenges that were common in their world. We're the product of ours, optimized for different challenges. But there's also evidence that human psychological resilience is more adaptable than we sometimes assume. Modern soldiers, astronauts, polar explorers, and others who undergo intense training and preparation can develop psychological resilience, comparable to what the Vikings possessed. The key seems to be adequate preparation, clear purpose, social support, and cultural frameworks that make the hardship meaningful. These were exactly what the Vikings had, and they're exactly what modern training programs for extreme environments try to recreate. This suggests that Vikings' psychological resilience wasn't mystical or superhuman. It was the product of specific, identifiable factors that can be analyzed and, to some extent, replicated. Understanding these factors doesn't diminish the Viking achievement. If anything, it makes it more impressive by revealing just how sophisticated their cultural adaptations were. They didn't survive months at sea through some innate toughness that modern people lack. They survived through carefully evolved cultural technologies that address genuine psychological needs in systematic ways. As we conclude this exploration, we should recognize that the Viking experience at sea offers valuable lessons for modern challenges. We live in an era facing different forms of extreme stress: climate change, pandemic, political instability, economic uncertainty, technological disruption. While these aren't identical to the challenges Vikings faced, they share some common elements. They create anxiety about the future, a sense of lack of control, exposure to threats that can't be completely avoided, the need to maintain function despite ongoing stress. The Viking response to their challenges suggests some potentially useful principles. The importance of community and mutual support during shared hardship. The value of having clear roles and responsibilities that give people agency and purpose. The power of narrative frameworks that make suffering meaningful rather than random. The benefit of spiritual or philosophical beliefs that help people accept what they can't control, while staying engaged with what they can. The necessity of balancing realism about danger with hope for positive outcomes. The value of gradual preparation and skill building rather than being thrown unprepared into crisis. These aren't perfect analogies. Our challenges are different from theirs in important ways, but the fundamental psychological dynamics of humans facing extreme stress have commonalities across time and context. The Vikings developed effective responses to their version of these dynamics. We can learn from their example while adapting their insights to our different circumstances. The Vikings survived months at sea without going insane through a combination of cultural conditioning, social structure, narrative tradition, spiritual belief, practical skill, and philosophical acceptance that together addressed every dimension of the psychological challenge they faced. They didn't avoid psychological damage, but they maintained function despite it and recovered afterward through cultural frameworks that normalized their experiences and integrated them into meaningful life narratives. They transformed the ocean from an alien nightmare into a familiar challenge through centuries of accumulated cultural adaptation. They weren't superhuman. They were human in a particularly sophisticated and well-adapted way. And their achievement deserves our recognition, our study, and perhaps our emulation as we face our own forms of extremity. The longships have been pulled up on beaches for the last time. The crews have scattered into history, but the psychological insights encoded in their cultural practices remain available to us if we are willing to look carefully and learn. In an age that sometimes feels like we're adrift on our own uncertain seas, the example of people who face genuine ocean chaos and emerge not broken, but functional might offer more than just historical interest. It might offer a template, however imperfect, for maintaining our own collective sanity through storms we didn't choose and can't completely control, but must nevertheless navigate to reach whatever shores await us on the far side of our own whale road.